Good afternoon. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And it is my great pleasure, also on behalf of my colleague Sushma Raman, to welcome our distinguished speakers and you, our audience, to this episode in our webinar series on the fierce urgency of now. On a weekly basis, this whole semester long, we have addressed challenges that one way or another are matters of economic justice at the intersection of racial justice. And today our topic is reparations, specifically reparations for African Americans, a topic of rather central concern at this intersection between racial and economic justice in the United States. Now, one way or another, demands for reparation have been around for many decades, even centuries, and we will learn a bit more about that today from our speakers. In recent years, however, the topic of reparations, specifically for African Americans, came to be of some prominence in the wake of one particular publication, namely Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations, that appeared in 2014 in the magazine The Atlantic. So that it's because of that article that I think there has been a lot more public awareness and debate about this subject than we've seen before. The basic case that specifically Coates makes is that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of American history. And once we get that misunderstanding cleared up, the case for systematic transfers of sorts to African Americans is pretty straightforward. And that misunderstanding goes something like this: slavery ended in 1865, and since then African Americans have had opportunities comparable to everybody else who arrived or had been in the United States. Opportunities, however, that African Americans specifically have often squandered, and as a result, they formed a pathological culture that explains their shortfall in wealth creation over the decades, right? That's the story that many people, I think, subscribe to. And but as African Americans themselves have always known, and as the broader public has increasingly come to realize over the years, virtually every important institution, public or private, in the United States has a history of not only neglecting African Americans, but of actually extracting resources from them. One area for which this is true in rather striking ways, and that's also the emphasis in Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in The Atlantic, is housing policy. As a part of federal housing policy in the 20th century, many white people for much of the 20th century had access to mortgages in ways that individually allowed them to start intergenerational wealth building, and that often collectively allowed them to develop their neighborhoods, and then especially also to generate enough property taxes to enable their children to get a good start in life in the local schools that then could be funded from the higher property taxes that a thriving neighborhood a thriving municipality could generate. But as opposed to that, Black people could become homeowners only by engaging with predatory lending practices, which not only undercut any process of intergenerational wealth building, but also led to a devaluation of housing stock in Black neighborhoods, which then also meant there was no tax base to generate the property taxes that would have been needed to fund good schools. The net result of all of that has been that the median family net worth of a white family in the United States in 2016 was about $170,000, and that of a Black family was less than $20,000. So a dramatic, truly dramatic difference there. However, with all that said, what in particular the presidential election this year, and what we are still working through here, has made clear, again, if it was necessary to learn that again, is that very large parts of the American public are not only not interested in having debates about reparations and about the underlying views about American history and the extent to which all of that has been shaped by white supremacy, but on the contrary, that very large parts of the American public will actually mobilize politically and support candidates who will undermine the very legitimacy of such debates. To them, any talk about white supremacy and reparations is toxic. So basically, we have seen two things in recent years: that we have seen an increasing awareness of these issues in large parts of the population, and we have seen an increase in strength of aversion to that very same debate. So in a way, it's kind of mirroring the election outcome that we saw, right? More intensity on the various sides involved. And that leads to this question that we very much have as a School of Public Policy, that many concerned citizens have, that all of us who are operating in this intersection between racial and economic justice, where does all this leave us now? So in that context, then, we are truly delighted to have with us today two very distinguished guests who have thought and have done a lot of activism around these topics for a long time. So we will first turn in a moment to Dr. Raymond Arnold Winbush, who is also known as Tikari Bioko, who is a scholar and activist known for his systematic thinking about the impact of white supremacy on the global Black community, so not just the United States, but more also thinking about these matters very much in a global perspective. And Dr. Winbush has been with these topics for a number of topics, has worked on themes like public policy and its connection to compensatory justice, the infusion of African studies into school curricula, and then also the impact of hip hop culture on the contemporary American landscape. He is currently a research professor and director of the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. And he is one of the main contributors really in research and advocacy. He has done all of that very extensively over the decades around the subject of reparations. So we're delighted to have you with us here today. And then our second speaker is going to be Yvette Modestine, who is a writer, a poet, and an activist who focuses on shedding light on the Afro-descendant experience in Latin America. Yvette was born and grew up in Panama, and is the founder and executive director of Encuentro Diaspora Afro in Boston. So right here, she is based right here with us in the Boston area. She was named as one of the 30 most influential Afro-Latinas in the world and has been profiled by the Boston Globe as a uniter for her work in bringing the Latin American and African American communities together. And uniter certainly is exactly what we need at this stage in history. As an artist and a licensed mental health clinician and a wellness facilitator, Yvette speaks to the acknowledgement of the historical pain of people of African descent and the awareness of the connection that would lead to the healing of our communities. So I will now first turn over to Ray, then Yvette will take over, and then Sushma will come in for the moderation of the Q&A. And you in the audience should feel free at any time to put your questions and comments in the chat function of the YouTube channel over there. And with all that said, without further ado, welcome to our two distinguished speakers, and over to Dr. Winbush.
Thank you, Mathias, and thank you, Sushma, too, for inviting Yvette and I to speak to you about what we consider one of the most important topics right now on the issue of justice for African people here. And I'd also like to thank the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University for this. So what I'm going to do, Yvette and I talked about me talking briefly about history, and then her talking about the entire, impact of reparations right now as it relates to what she's doing right now. So I'm going to try to summarize in a few minutes. Let me see. Let me get this screen share going. Okay. Let's see. We're almost there. Okay, can everybody see that? I hope so. I want to just give a brief introduction to reparations for the European enslavement of Africans. So I'm going to try to summarize in 8 or 10 minutes what has been going on for 579 years since Africans were first stolen from their homelands on the continent. I think this quote by Ralph Wiley summarizes almost everything that I feel about reparations in the United States. Give me the free labor of one Black person for 1 year, I would be a rich man. Give me the free labor of a dozen Black people for 12 years, I would be a very rich man. Give me the free labor of millions of Black people for 250 years, I would be America. So slavery is considered by the UN and other international groups as a crime against humanity. It's very important to remember that, because there are no statutes of limitations on a crime against humanity. And I'm not going to go through these 9 areas, but trust me that African people throughout the world have experienced all of them: murder, enslavement, deportation, and so forth. So it's just the way it has been for the past 400, nearly 500 years. The issue of reparation has a long history among American Africans. There's a picture here of Elizabeth Freeman. She was otherwise known as Mum Bet, lived in Massachusetts, of all places, and she was the step-great-great-grandmother of none other than a Harvard alum, W.E.B. Du Bois. She was one day going to her mistress was going to hit another servant, and Mum Bet jumped in front of her, and she hit her with a heated shovel, and there was a wound on her arm that she left open for many months. She hired an attorney in 1781 named Theodore Sedgwick, and she sued, and as far as we know, the first recorded lawsuit about suing for freedom from enslavement. Interesting enough, Theodore Sedgwick, and this is just one of these asides that I like to put in these lectures, Theodore Sedgwick is the 4th grandfather of Kyra Sedgwick, the actress right now. She won her case and also 30 shillings for her freedom. And so we go from 1781 to just the next year of 1782, and Belinda Royale Sutton heard about Elizabeth Freeman's case, and she sued her so-called master, Isaac Royal, for 50 years of unpaid labor, and she won her case of about 15 pounds and 12 shillings, which was equivalent to about $2,400 a year. What's interesting is that her so-called master, Isaac Royal, fled to Canada at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, American Revolutionary War, and he was wondering out loud, and actually wrote this in a letter. He did not understand why Belinda was so angry at him for his enslavement of her. The other interesting thing about this is that Isaac Royal endowed the School of Law at Harvard in his will, and gave its first professorship in his will in 1779. And then we come to the famous phrase among African Americans on the issue of reparations, which is 40 acres and a mule in 1865. On January 16th, 1865, General William Tecumseh Sherman allocated, and through his field order, 400,000 acres of land on the east coast of the United States, places in Georgia, South Carolina, the southern part of North Carolina. And interesting enough, in the legislation, it did not say 40 acres and a mule, but when you sold someone land during those days, a mule was implied in the sale. It would like me be selling a car to you, Mathias, right now, and saying it doesn't have an engine in it. You would assume that it had an engine in it. So that's the famous 40 acres and a mule. From there, we move on to Cali House, who organized the first major organization dealing with reparations in this country, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association. She got in order to become a member, you would join for $2.50 and then pay 25 cents a week into this fund. And she actually organized over 600,000 people during this time. In 1915, she sued the government of the United States for $68 million. And she said that was the amount of cotton collected between 1862 and 1868 in the United States. And she wanted that for the 600,000 enslaved African or formerly enslaved Africans. In that same year, she was indicted for mail fraud, which she did not commit, and spent 1 year in jail and wound up dying in Nashville, Tennessee. So, and you got to understand that the post office in those days would almost be the equivalent of Facebook. And they used it to make sure that she did not get the pensions for the ex-slaves that many Confederate soldiers had gotten. Queen Mother Moore, many, many years later, educated herself by reading the writings of Frederick Douglass and Marcus Garvey. And in 1963, she actually presented to John F. Kennedy on the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation 1 million signatures petitioning the government for reparations on behalf of the descendants of African slaves. She was a major figure. Women have played a major role in the reparations struggle to this day. And in 1969, on a Sunday morning in May, as clergy processed into the sanctuary of New York's August Riverside Church, civil rights activist James Foreman vaulted into the pulpit. He actually interrupted the sermon and demanded $500 million for reparations for the mistreatment of African Americans from white churches and synagogues. Some of this money was given, but not all of it was. So a definition of reparations quickly is that it's a payment of a debt owed, and this is in COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations America. The atonement for wrongdoings, to make amends, to make one whole again, and so forth. And some examples of reparations in this country, which are as American as apple pie. $1 billion for the Alaska Natives land settlement. Money has gone to the Lakota of South Dakota, the Klamath of Oregon, and of course, something that we're all familiar with, the $1.2 billion for Japanese Americans following their internment in World War II. So opponents to reparations say that reparations are going to divide the races even further. Why can't we just leave the past alone? Can't we all just get along? I call this the Rodney King argument. And I think we've always been divided as a nation on the issue of race. I said I was not going to mention anything about the occupier of the White House, but I think that we know that this has always been an issue among Americans on the issue of racism and how it impacts Black folk. Another thing is that opponents of reparations say, but slavery happened a long time ago. Why should I pay for something that I never participated in, nor my family members? I, believe it or not, was not born during World War II and had nothing to do with the detention of Japanese Americans during the war. But in 1988, that radical president, Ronald Reagan, levied a tax on Americans for $1.2 billion for reparations for the internment of Japanese, which was considered a crime against humanity. And the most important thing to remember is that those things that happened during enslavement still have impact today on Black folk. And I'm going to leave it now to Yvette to talk about how that occurs.
Thanks, Ray. Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Mathias and Sushma, for inviting us. Before I start, in the tradition of our people, I give thanks to those whose shoulders we stand on and call on them for their resiliency and their fearlessness that continues to guide us on this journey. I wanted to pick up on the 5 injuries. And Ray, could we put that up just for a little bit, the last slide, and bring it into today. And I sit here proudly sharing with you as a National African American Reparations Commissioner, so NARC, and also a member of NCOBRA. And the 5 injuries came out of the work of NCOBRA, led by and chaired by attorney Adjoa Ajitoro, who thought that, how do we bring this down and highlight it? But before I also start, Mathias mentioned in my introduction that I am born and raised in Panama. And part of the reparations conversation that's intense is that who are the Africans that can have that conversation within the US? And in bringing that Pan-African global perspective is as an African from the Americas, and specifically from Panama, I was born and raised into the Jim Crow colonized territory of Panama that was ruled by American laws. So that is my point of entry in the conversation of seeking reparations for all people of African descent, for all Africans in the Americas, especially those who may not have had their direct story here, but direct story with the US impact. And Panama's Canal Zone is that. So I wanted to start first and foremost, people and nationhood is the destruction of African people's culture. And one of the immediate today, because as Ray said, everyone thinks, oh, it happened in the past, it's not happening now. No, it's happening now. One of the immediate examples of the stealing and the taking away of our culture and what that does to our ability to move and retain our family structures, our way of living, our traditions, speaks to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And now the folks in Tulsa have put a reparations case against Tulsa because of that massacre that happened. And one of the survivors, 105-year-old Leslie Benningfield Randall, speaks of still suffering from the emotional and physical distress today, 100 years after, because of the dismissal or the getting away or doing away with what many will call Black Wall Street. As it relates to education, you know, the issue of reparations and education is the denial of our right to an education started in slavery, with criminal sanctions imposed on our enslaved ancestors who learned and anyone who taught them to read or write. How interesting that that language applies to 2020 and with the pandemic. And what the pandemic has highlighted is the disparities that exist in our educational system. Students of color were greatly more impacted due to the pandemic and the schooling and what it meant and how they're being taught. Because what also came out is, how are they being taught African-American history? Some schools don't even teach African-American history beyond Black History Month. And what does that mean? But specific, also as an organizer in for the Codman Square NDC here in Boston, one of the things around education that we had to deal with that was very specific to reparative justice, this ongoing conversation about repairing the damage, is that certain things, the lack of reliable internet or electronic device for remote learning for a lot of our families. We had to do a lot of work to making sure that folks had laptops, to make sure that folks had internet. And that speaks to the disparities that exist. It wasn't an easy transition from lockdown to our families, Black families having what they needed. And it's not out of their strength to have it, it's the lack of access that exists and the denial of that equality and that equity that exists. Health, as we know, is a high piece, you know, because the most impacted by COVID have been Black people, Black and brown people. Specifically in Boston, the hot spots, the red spots in the Massachusetts area are highly in the Black communities. And then Monday, the American Medical Association came out with identifying racism as a public health issue. So the daily constant fighting and pushing back on the attack on our bodies, our minds, our health, as Black women, as Black men, the policing of our bodies is constantly affecting us. And that I have seen even greater during the pandemic because many of us sort of move through life and just trying to survive. And the pandemic slowed it down. And for many families, it highlighted how the lack of equity exists in our communities and in our spaces around the country and in the state. Criminal justice system speaks to the enslavement of African peoples necessitated the development of a dual punishment system that continues to exist in the US. My immediate example of this is there still has not been justice for Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and the many who have been killed with the rising of the call, Black Lives Matter. So the system does not see us in our human light. And most of these people that we have raised their name now, Breonna Taylor, get re-victimized even after they've been brutally shot by police. And I want to share a very personal story around criminal punishment. My nephew was 11 years old when Trayvon Martin died. And the night of the result, my sister and I were crying on the phone. And he was in the background saying, I don't understand why you're crying. He's not even family. My nephew is now 19. So his entire story is that he has seen Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, all killed by police and no justice has been served. So that is his only narrative, is that he does not know what justice looks like because he has only seen injustice. So that is a part of reparative justice. When are we going to have, not have to go through 2 and 3 times or waiting to see if a police officer is going to be found guilty for killing a Black woman in her home, in her bed? The next piece is the wealth and poverty. And that has also been highlighted during this time. About 2 years ago, there was a report in Boston that by the time Black families go home, there's only $8 left. That continues to stand, and it continues to get worse now because we are the ones that were the frontline workers. We were the ones that were the essential workers. We are the ones that lost the jobs. We are the ones that are getting impacted. Boston had a moratorium, one of the best moratoriums in the country around stopping evictions and foreclosure. It ended on October 17th. And although the numbers are going up in Massachusetts, we're going back to some quarantine lockdowns, we're on a curfew, people are losing their jobs again, unemployment is getting stopped soon, and we haven't extended a moratorium on housing and people are getting evicted during a pandemic where you're telling them don't move, be safe, but at the same time you have landlords evicting these same people. A report that was done by one of my mentors, James Jennings, from the Tufts University policy department, and he wrote this report with Ajamu Brown around reparations. And one of the things that he says, just for me to close out and give time for Q&A, is that reparations can be an economic tool to both atone and mitigate the continuing impacts of historical injustices born of continual structural racial inequalities. Given the inevitable rapid restructuring of the global economy due to the pandemic, which has hit many working class communities of color harder than most, and the continuing inequality that led to Black Lives Matter movement, the nation now has an opportunity to seriously implement a robust reparations plan for Black Americans to address its moral responsibility for the past wrongs. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much again. I'm really excited to be with you and excited to share this space with Ray.
Thank you both, Ray and Yvette, for joining us, and Mathias for getting us started in today's conversation. We welcome our audience to post your questions and clarifications, request clarifications in the chat, and we will draw on some of them. And I will start perhaps with a question drawing on your last points, Yvette, and I'll open it up to both of you. So you talk about atoning and mitigating, and I'm wondering how you think, this should be structured, because, in order to ensure that this doesn't happen again, that the inequities of the past are adequately addressed, and money will never sufficiently address everything. How do we also think about how institutions are reformed and restructured to ensure that there's both sort of atonement for the past, but also mitigation to ensure that the future is more equitable and just for future generations? So
my first response is going to be my radical response is that the whole thing needs to be shaken up and down, as Frantz Fanon says. So, you know, you cannot continue to atone on a system that is broken. It is deeply broken. We spent the last couple of weeks waiting through the elections, and my sadness wasn't, or concern wasn't about the results. My sadness was that we're even having the conversation. And that speaks to the lack of acknowledgement of how deeply divided and broken this system is. So atonement means acknowledging that the system is broken. Atonement means even if you've studied us, you're not an expert on us. You don't live our lives. You don't have to walk out your door and worry about what's going to happen today because you're Black. So the fact that we haven't even acknowledged that, you know, we have jurors coming out and saying that the process for Breonna Taylor was not just. And we don't have anyone saying, you know what, that's true. Fix this, solve this. Instead, we drag it and we re-victimize these victims for just being Black. For just being Black. When we get killed, it's animalistic. I remember when Michael Brown was killed and I read the police report. I was sharing this with Ray earlier. It's like, he was this big animal. When George Zimmerman spoke about Trayvon Martin, it was and he was a teenager. So atonement has to come with our everyday language. If your language still leans on whiteness, still leans on white supremacy, still allows someone to be standing on someone's neck to look above, then we are nowhere close to atoning, because atonement means recognizing.
Yeah, and I want to underscore everything that Yvette said. And see, I think in general, like Yvette, the country lives on a series of myths about itself. And people classified white live on myths about what this country is all about. I mean, I personally have had death threats for talking about Sally Hemings, you know, who were the stepchildren, if you please, of Thomas Jefferson, that I'm sullying his memory. I think this country lives on myths, and the myths are acted out in a variety of ways. We saw right before the election, for example, that, you know, Biden's going to stomp, you know, Trump because people know that he's a racist. People know that he incarcerates children on the southern border. He's made all these sexist statements, but we have 70 million people who voted for him. And I don't want to sound cynical, but it makes me believe that this country isn't ready for the atonement that it needs desperately to continue to exist.
So, I also don't want to talk about the recent past, but I will say that a few months ago, there were these attacks on critical race theory. And one of the things I was fortunate enough to do this year was, as a lifelong learner, I took summer school with Kim Crenshaw and Devin Carbado and others. It was like a UCLA Columbia Law School program. And it was really, you know, quite altering in many, many ways. And I'm just wondering, in this current environment, you know, with attacks on critical race theory, or even private institutions like Stanford saying that you cannot, you know, say that we are affected by systemic racism, where are the entry points for revisiting how sectors and institutions approach sort of the legacy of racial discrimination?
Well, let me start this off. See, I think that this country already knows that it's racist. I really believe that. For example, we saw, you know, after last summer, you know, they buried Aunt Jemima, they buried Uncle Ben. Now, you can't tell me that, you know, that they didn't know that Ben and Jemima were problematic 70, 80 years ago. You saw all of these corporations saying, you know, including the National Basketball Association. Well, we're going to hang Black Lives Matter on the back of everybody's jersey. I think this country knows that it's racist. I think it knows that it's racist to its core. But if I were a white person, I would say this system has worked for me and my ancestors for the past 200 years. Why should I change it? We thought less white women were going to vote for Trump this time around. 53% did in 2016. Instead, we had more who voted for him this year, 55%. So, you know, I don't want to sound cynical again, but it's hard to be optimistic about a country that lives in the state of denial. My colleague, Michael Eric Dyson, said we may well call the United States of amnesia when it comes to enslavement, reparations, and its, you know, sordid past.
And then to add to that is the folks. So most of the folks that lead sort of these organizations and these companies are white. And you cannot be able to really understand what this means if you're only coming through those white lens. So at what point do you restructure and bring more Black leadership in? At what point do you, make sure that your leadership has a diverse group of folks? Like, those are the things that need to be done. Just removing the box and some of that is not enough. It means, how are you restructuring your power structure within those organizations? How are you having the conversation that doesn't threaten people and doesn't put Black people to be always telling their story for you to feel better? It was like, no, this is an everyday thing for us. And, it doesn't go away. You see it in very minuscule way with how people, when you are in a store, my young people, you have to talk about going in the store and being followed. That all has to do with the psyche of what it means to be Black in this country and what comes with it. So the conversation cannot be, the NFL had an opportunity to lead. I'm still with Cap, and he's not playing. But everyone that's making the decisions in the NFL, although they have players and everything, those owners have the final say. And the last time I checked, there's not too many Black owners.
So in light of these rather bleak aspects that we have now encountered, I'm wondering a little bit, so what's the way forward here? So my question in a minute for you is going to be, what is it that you hope the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration, this new period in American government can actually do about that, given how entrenched a situation this is? But before actually getting to that question, let me just add a couple of things, just to also, in a way, adding to these kind of notes of pessimism that you just both articulated. Right? So a few weeks ago in this series, we had Michael Dawson from the University of Chicago, who is a researcher on Black political thought, and also especially on how Blacks have been faring under neoliberalism. And he's also a public opinion researcher. And he has often done polling on public opinion research on how people feel about reparations. And he persistently found that the average white person is very strongly against reparations. What he does find, so if it's kind of interesting, the way he varies the way he's asking about that, right? So if he's asking about reparations also for Japanese Americans from the internment experience in the Second World War, and white people tend to be supportive of that, of the fact that, as Ray, you mentioned that this was done, and they are generally supportive of that. However, one of the most striking things that he found is if he is asking about reparations for African Americans first, then the mood turns so negative that when the average white person comes to the question about the Japanese, they're no longer in favor of that either. That's just how they get primed. So that's how entrenched this is, right? And then at the same time, one thing that I think when we keep getting reports about this, and there was also a major assessment of the state of democracy that the American Academy of Arts and Sciences just published under co-leadership of my colleague Daniel Allen here at the Carr Center for Ethics, and they looked into how civic education unfolds in this country, and they find that, I mean, they find how differently American history is taught around the country. The standard story that I referred to in my introduction, that is simply how many people operate. And we increasingly also find teachers who are, so Ray, you mentioned you got threats, you got death threats for your positions. Increasingly, more and more teachers around the country are reporting that as they teach history in any other way than the standard story, they are being threatened, and so they change careers, they move away, or they're simply not teaching it that way, right? So all of that is pretty bleak, and the bleakness just got reinforced, I think, in the election result. And so what's the hope here? Do you have hope? I mean, proposals for the Biden administration, maybe?
Well,
let Ray go first.
I don't know, but look, it's hard to have hope if you're African in America. I mean, let's be real. The only people that can end racism, white supremacy in this country are people who are classified as white. Black people cannot end that. Native Americans can, Japanese can, no one can do that. I think that there's a visceral guilt that is felt by the average person answering those polls about reparations for African Americans. I've asked people who have asked me that, white people who have said, I said, name, they'll be all in favor of reparations for the Japanese. I said, well, name me 10 Japanese millionaires, and they can't do it. But then if I said, name 10 Black millionaires, they'll immediately say, oh, you're going to give reparations to Oprah Winfrey and Jay-Z? Are they getting reparations? And it's like this cynical game that they're playing with me, but mostly to themselves about, I don't really want to give you anything. When we give to Black people, we take from white people. And I've had people actually say that. And so I think that it's hard not to be, I don't want to say cynical, but hopeful about, that somehow this country is going to get itself together relative to racism and start doing the right thing. If you had asked me, I went through the civil rights movement. If you had asked me in 1968 on the night that Dr. King got killed, whether or not we would have a president of the United States nearly 60 years later that was spouting racism, I would say that's impossible. We really thought that this dream that King had would be fulfilled by now. It isn't. So, I don't want to sound cynical, but it's hard not to be cynical and feel a certain amount of hopelessness in this country's ability to deal with racism. And I think that's why books like, what's the guy up your way in Boston, Yvette, that we were talking about earlier?
Abraham.
Yeah, I think that his book is it's more hopeful, and that's why it's reached #1 as opposed to Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, which is read, but Ta-Nehisi is more realistic about racism than I think Abraham is.
So, and then I wanted to add, because I think Ray went from the outside, and my hope comes from the inside. My response to that is June Jordan's quote, "We are the ones we've been waiting for." And I think that's how we are going to have to be. We have to know and acknowledge what's happening on the outside of our community and what's around us. But what we also need to do is build within. How do we as Africans, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, who all occupy this United States of America as people of African descent, how do we create our own agenda through our own lens, through our own reality, through our own experiences? And that's where my hope is. My community organizing is not seeing us from a place of weakness, but from a place of strength. The fact that we still get up every day knowing everything that's coming at us speaks to those ancestors whose shoulders we stand on, who prepared us to, fight till we win. And we may not win the outside fight, but I think the inside fight, that we can see each other better, support each other better, love each other better, is going to be my hopeful piece as we move forward.
Thank you. I'm wondering if either of you could comment on the recent signing of a bill by California Governor Newsom, which established a task force to study and make recommendations on reparations, as well as whether you see a path forward for HR 40, which has been kind of, pending for so long. Where is there space for either the California legislation and models like that in other states versus at the national level?
Well, I applaud Governor Newsom for, assembling that panel and the commission to study reparations. And let's be clear, I'm sure we are, that reparations are already taking places in places like Evanston, Illinois, with Councilwoman Robin Rue Simmons. I mean, she has been instrumental. Cam Newton, the national co-chair of NCOBRA, has done a lot of work with her about reparations. Burlington, Vermont, just this week appointed a commission as well. So I am hopeful. I think reparations are going to happen, I think, in this country. What I'm not hopeful for is that white attitudes are going to change. And there's a difference. I think reparations are inevitable in this country, but I don't think white attitudes towards it, and I'm not trying to say 100%, like Mathias said, a few minutes ago, I think that a larger portion of white people will support reparations as time goes by, just like there's a larger portion now that supports it as opposed to 15 years ago. But whether or not that core idea of being an American is being white, Protestant, and male, I'm not sure that's going to go away anytime soon.
And HR 40 is being moved. It was rewritten last year, and people have criticism about it, but HR 40 is just an introduction to have a conversation. I mean, it's not giving anything majorly specific of the ask. It's saying, acknowledge it, let's look at it, let's have a conversation about it, let's, the 10-point program that you can find on the NARC website, let's, look at it from these different points. And it's been blocked and, sideways and everything. So that within itself says, if the government, is not even leaning into it, then how do you then bring that out into the community? So there's already hesitation. I think it was last year when the conversation was really getting hot, Mitch McConnell came out and said, I don't know why we're having this conversation, because that was in the past. And then it made me go read more about his story, and then realizing, oh, by the way, you come from a family that has benefited off the backs of African Americans. So how dare you say that this is not a current conversation? So those are some of the things that we will have to see, but I'm not, and I know Ray's not. We're not going to wait for anybody to come and knock at the door and invite us to a table. We're going to keep creating new tables and keep knocking down doors.
I'm also curious what your thoughts are about policy proposals like, student loan debt or other programs that would benefit low-income people regardless of race. And so I'm curious about your thoughts in terms of strategy, like the explicit focus on racial justice and reparations for past harms and kind of resetting institutions, and then the other kinds of parallel, if you will, or intersecting movements that are occurring out there on economic equity, around wages for workers, student loan cancellation, et cetera. What are your thoughts of synergies and divergences?
Well, I'm all for it. And, reparations activists, and Yvette can testify to this, it's not just about money. It's about scholarships. It's about tax abatement. It's about housing. it's about a variety of things. It's just like in 1954 when Brown v. Board passed. Out of that, less than 10 years later, we had affirmative action, Title IX, the Voting Rights Act. All of this spun out of Brown versus Board. I think the same thing is going to happen with reparations. So I'm all for, student loan abatement. God knows I've got a daughter that has some right now, so I'm all for that. And I think that we've got to continue to press all of these issues that are talking about injustice. And America just seems like it's resisting a lot of these things. These so-called liberal programs and the denigration of the squad, the four, powerful sisters in the Congress right now, they're a reflection of this country's resistance to talking about just things.
Yeah, that is as direct as it gets. I think, those are specific acts that need to happen for us to see that there is progression in the conversation. I really think the term reparations, people ask why you're interested in reparations. I'm not just interested in reparations because I'm a reparations commissioner or whatever, but I think as long as you're Black in the world, you know for a fact that you are not entering any space on the equal playing field. And as long as that continues, then something has got to give to make it better or easier access or more accessible for our young people to get to schools and continue to rise and shine.
So we have two questions from the audience, and I'll ask them both so that you could respond to either or both. So Abdul Rahim wants to know if there have been, I'm going to try and paraphrase this, but I think if there's been US government transgressions in other countries, right, then how does that affect this conversation? I know you had talked about sort of global movements. It would be helpful to contextualize that. And Mosa wants to know whether insisting on reparations, this comes back to your slides earlier, Ray, but whether insisting on reparations could cause greater pushback and would create sort of more space for the far right to kind of push back against. So, I'd love your thoughts on either or both questions.
Well,
so the first one was around how does what the US has done in other countries affect and bring into this conversation? Because everything that we're talking about here now in the US happened in this American territory that was called the Canal Zone. People of African descent were not, although more educated, and I saw this with both of my parents, although more educated than the white workers, were not allowed to be supervisors to white men or white women. Our houses, we lived in segregated communities, the Black communities being Rainbow City, Pedro Miguel, Paraíso, and Gamboa. And it was written in the American colonial documents that our houses could not be the same size as the white community because they didn't want us to have the same thing they had. We had segregated schools. We had, and Brown versus the Board of Education was passed here in the 50s. I am the first group of students that entered into predominantly white schools in Panama, and that was in 1978. That they desegregated the schools and desegregated the territory. So this conversation speaks to the US, not only for African Americans and folks in the US to understand that the US impact and their abuse and their injustice was not just in this land, it was any land that they occupied and colonized and brought those same practices.
And I wanted to add to that. See, the first part of the question about the pushback. I mean, Black folk are used to that. That's just the way it is, that whatever people perceive that there's some kind of gain in the Black community, be it being freed from enslavement, Brown versus Board, there's always been pushback. And I think as a psychologist, part of this is that, white people don't make good minorities. Like they have issues about saying, we are increasingly less of the American population. And globally, you know, people classified as white are only about 8% of the world's population. And there's a pushback that has been historic with the Aboriginal people, with Indians, and when they were colonized by the British. I mean, this is like standard across the world about how white people push back against people of color when there's a perceived gain by those people of color. It's just kind of standard operating procedure.
So I know in your presentations, both of you touched on different organizations and experts in this space. And I'm wondering if each of you could share some resources for our audience. It could be either academic centers or academics that are doing research in this area. It could be books that you highly recommend. It could be activist organizations. It could be even groups that are working in sort of a Pan-African context. I'd love to hear your thoughts and recommendations before we close.
Yvette, why don't you start out with NARC?
Yeah, just the National African American Reparations Commission, and you can visit the website at ibw21.org. You could visit our 10-point programs and also see the work that's being done. I think the list of commissioners speaks to how widely we're doing the work. Also in Cobra, and Ray has been part of Cobra longer, so he could speak a little to that. I think December 12th is a great organization out of New York with Brother Roger Wareham, who is a real leader in this conversation. And they are doing some great work. I would visit them. The Malcolm X Grassroots Committee also doing some great work. In Boston, you know, there's so many different spaces. The Boston Coalition for COVID Coalition was founded during this time, and also just Encuentro Diaspora Afro if you want to learn more about the African Pan-African connection. Those are some, and then just you know, read anything by, may he rest in light and peace, Baba Comrade Roel, who recently passed, and he really was passionate about this issue. Baba Jeremiah Wright. Anything by Don Rojas. You know, I don't want to get into calling names because I'm such a product of all of these people, but there are folks that are really doing this work on a daily basis that I would recommend, and you know, to take a look at the NARC and the NCOBRA. Cam Howard, you know, the head of NCOBRA, amazing work, colleague and mentor and friend. Mama Joanne Watson, who worked closely with, you know, from the beginning with HR 40. So there's a lot of people out there that are doing this work that I would recommend folks to, and Ray's books really set the tone for how you move forward in understanding.
Yeah. You know, I would add quickly Randall Robinson's book, The Debt.
The Debt.
Sounds self-serving, but, you know, Should America Pay, as well as Belinda's petition, things that I have written. So just Google us and we're online. And National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations America is the oldest reparations group in this country, definitely.
Terrific. Thank you both, Ray and Yvette, for joining us today. And thank you to our audience as well. Our last session for the semester will be with Dr. Megan Francis. We will be talking about social movements next week, and no, not next week, the following week. And we look forward to our audience joining us then. Thank you both.